Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Cobalt, Cradle of the Demon Metals, Birth of a Mining Superpower, by Charlie Angus. Narrated by Charles Constant. Cobalt, Ontario resulted in so much lying, deceit, fraud, overreaching ambition, and such a Pandora's box of miseries that it would almost have been better if the place had never been discovered. Reverend Samuel Blake, 1911. Preface. The Demon Metal. The world is searching for cobalt, the miracle ingredient of the digital age. The metal's capacity to store energy and stabilize conductors has made possible the proliferation of rechargeable batteries, smartphones, and laptops. More crucially, in the face of catastrophic climate change, cobalt offers the hope of a clean energy future. Access to reliable supplies of cobalt will be essential if we are to advance into the era of the mass-produced electric vehicle. But cobalt has a much darker side. The relentless drive to feed the cobalt needs of Silicon Valley has led to appalling levels of degradation, child abuse, and environmental damage in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, the world's #1 cobalt producer. The situation is so dire that human rights campaigners have denounced cobalt as the blood mineral of the 21st century. Tesla, Google, and Apple would love to cut their ties with the abuses in the DRC, but cobalt is an extremely elusive metal. Thus, it is not surprising that in 2020, billionaires Jeff Bezos, Michael Bloomberg, and Bill Gates formed a mining company to seek out new sources of cobalt in northern Canada. They named their company Cobalt Metals. Kobold is a variant of the German word for cobalt, derived from the kobalos, a satyr and shapeshifter in Greek mythology who mocked the work of humans. In the Middle Ages, the kobalos became the kobold, a demon living in the mines of Germany. The men who made their way into the perpetual darkness of the metal mines knew the demons were close from a burning sensation on their fingertips as they touched the cobalt-laced rock. And they knew the kobolds were watching them from the telltale sounds of banging and footsteps echoing through the caverns. To anyone who has stood in the dark depths of an underground mine chamber, such superstitions are perfectly understandable. As miners dig deeper, the pressure from the millions of tons of earth above them increases. This pressure causes the weight around the underground openings to shift, eliciting a terrible groaning. Sometimes there's a loud banging, like two boxcars hitting each other in a freight yard. Other times the pressure is more subtle, like the sharp snap of a twig being stepped on, which evokes the deeply unsettling feeling of being stalked in the blackness. Mining traditions around the world have variations of the legend of the cobalt. In the silver mines of Bolivia, the miners leave offerings for El Tío, the devil spirit. In Cornish mines, there are stories of the knockers. Welsh miners worked alongside the Coblinau. In some cases, these creatures are condemned spirits, forced to work for eternity for no gain. In other cultures, the goblins help the miners by leading them to the ore. For miners in Germany, the kobold held a particular menace. The metal was even denounced from the pulpit by a 16th-century Reformation firebrand who called it the Black Devil. Cobalt is elusive because it has no distinctive color in its natural form, which made it hard to spot amid the mixture of nickel and copper ores. But when miners burned rock where cobalt was present, the airborne dust and vapors had the potential to kill or seriously incapacitate them. Little wonder that they feared the demon metal. It is doubtful that today's billionaire class has reflected much on the dark power of the kobold. They are looking to strike the next great mineral rush, which is taking place within a broader geopolitical struggle to control the market in strategic metals. The cobalt rush has drawn investors back to a little town in northern Ontario, a place called Cobalt. There is a powerful synchronicity in this renewed interest in Cobalt, Ontario. This is not just some old mining town looking for one more chance to flourish. The events that took place here more than a century ago set Canada on its path to becoming the world's preeminent resource extraction superpower. The country dominates the global industry. 3/4 of the world's mining companies are registered in Canada. The maple leaf flies over international zones of resource exploitation, ranging from uranium mines in the former states of the Soviet Union to gold projects in the Amazon to the metal deposits of Africa, where horrific human rights abuses are accepted as part of the cost of doing business. To make sense of this, we need to return to Cobalt, the place that let loose the demons of the earth. Introduction. The Cradle. Something dramatic happened here. You get that sense as soon as you arrive in the town of Cobalt, population 1,500, with its winding streets and hodgepodge of little houses perched atop rocky ridges. The locals will tell you about the immense wealth, riches that dwarfed the Klondike, hills that flowed with streams of pure silver that had been polished smooth by the glaciers and touched with a beautiful pink glow. This color was the fingerprint of the cobalt demons, as cobalt turns pink when it oxidizes. The wealth of these magnificent rose-silver veins was so valuable that during the First World War the British government pleaded with Canadian authorities to avoid a miners' strike at Cobalt because of the impact it would have had on the war effort. That wealth is long gone. What remains are fading photographs at the local museum, showing streets packed with men in Stetsons, hustlers in suits, and immigrant families hauling their worldly possessions off the train. At a time when settlers in Canada were largely Anglo-Protestant or Francophone Catholic, Cobalt was giving birth to the multicultural future, all in a ramshackle place that looked like the stage set for a Wild West movie. Cobalt has been designated as both a National Historic Site and the most historic community in Ontario, but few people have heard of it. At best, it is considered to be quirky local history, but its significance has a much broader international context. Resource extraction has always taken place globally. The pursuit of natural resource wealth has pushed industry into some of the world's most far-flung frontiers and affected indigenous people all over the planet. And the town of Cobalt is more than a mere footnote in the history of this worldwide movement of capital and resources. By disentangling the story of Cobalt from the parochial politeness of local Canadian history, we orient ourselves with deeper issues such as how the pressure of resource exploitation drove the settlement of the indigenous lands of the Americas, both prior to and as a result of the silver rush in Cobalt. We can begin with the obvious question: what happened to the money? There are no visible signs of wealth in Cobalt anymore. The famous silver sidewalk, an exceptionally rich and smooth vein, is now just a fenced-off hole. Long gone is the local stock exchange that presaged and helped launch the Toronto and Vancouver financial exchanges. The once extensive streetcar system is relegated to the stuff of lore. What remains is the detritus of a great war against the earth. The hills are deeply scarred with broken rock and blasted-out canyons. Tag alders and poplars have slowly reclaimed the multitude of mining sites that are strewn with rotting timbers, iron pipes, rusted old pails, and the occasional boot. And then there are the arsenic-green beaches, where the toxic waste from 100 mining operations was dumped into the once clear glacial waters. Cobalt was all about the money, and not a dime was left behind when all was said and done. But the implications of the mining boom from 1903 to 1921 were enormous. The sudden flush of silver money from the mines of Cobalt hit sleepy Edwardian Canada like a high-octane jolt, strong enough to change the trajectory of development in both Ontario and Canada. Cobalt elevated a new financial elite, who quickly learned that the real riches of the northern mines were not to be found with a pick and shovel, but by mastering the financial alchemy of hustling mining plays and manipulating the stock market. And thus began the quick ascendancy of Toronto from provincial backwater to economic powerhouse. At one time, Toronto was the butt of a joke among American financiers. Toronto? Ah, yes, that's where you switch the trains to get to Cobalt. But thanks to lessons learned at Cobalt, Toronto transformed itself into the financial center of a rapidly growing resource industry. This industry was built with a particular toolbox of skills that had been developed in Cobalt: financial, regulatory, and industrial. And this toolbox has since been exported around the world. Little wonder that the nation's powerful mining industry refers to Cobalt as the cradle of Canadian mining. Across northern Canada, there are mining communities that were born in that cradle. Like cobalt, they thrive or die depending on the wealth beneath their streets and the price of metals on the international markets. In Canada, it is taken as a given that such boom-bust disparity is part of the social contract of northern existence. It seems self-evident that the immense resources of the northern hinterland exist to benefit the needs of the urban heartland, or the shareholders of multinational corporations. Such a worldview is only possible because we have allowed ourselves to accept the winner's version of what happened at Cobalt. But Cobalt was a battleground for multiple visions of how the wealth of the earth could be used and who should be its beneficiaries. Issues of social justice that dominate the discourse today, resource exploitation versus environmental concerns and indigenous rights, multicultural accommodation versus xenophobic suspicion, the power of the 1% in the face of class resistance, were battled out in the shabby streets of Cobalt. The economic, social, and political struggles that took place in Cobalt made it a crucible for the Canada that was to come. The story of Canada's frontier expansion is a long litany of booster tales and romantic legends, with Cobalt relegated to the minor role of an exciting adventure in a simpler time. But if we look closer, we find there are competing versions of this settler story that give rise to complex questions. There is a history that frames Cobalt and its neighboring region of Temagami as part of the natural birthright of the Canadian nation. Within this history, Cobalt symbolizes the peace, order, and good government of the Canadian nation-state, claiming and developing what is considered naturally ours. And there is an alternate history that places Cobalt within the story of the Americas. Culturally and economically, Cobalt has roots in the great American gold rush tradition. It is very much an orphan child of the legendary mining booms of Comstock Lode, Cripple Creek, and Butte. Both of these narratives, Canadian nationalist and American frontier, share a similar conclusion by presenting the cobalt silver rush as a tale of white adventurers unlocking the hidden wealth of the continent. But there is a powerful prehistory that negates this claim. Indigenous people had been mining cobalt silver for thousands of years. Silver from the region has been found in jewelry, pottery, and religious ornamentation across eastern North America, indicating that cobalt silver was highly valued in an extensive trading network that predates European contact by more than 1,000 years. Indigenous mining and trade have long been completely overlooked in the histories of northern Canada, and this whitewashing of the story of Cobalt is part of a much larger erasure of Indigenous claims to resource lands. Thus, restoring voices removed from history isn't simply about correcting the record. It is an inherently political act. This book is not just the history of a place, but also a reflection on how a nation that is dependent on resource exploitation has curated and rewritten its complex relationship with Indigenous rights, the environment, and the North. In the traditional telling of the Cobalt story, there are many crucial historical voices that have been overlooked or erased. Cobalt was a place where the multicultural and multiracial working class fought back against the power of capital with revolutionary visions of inter-ethnic solidarity, even in the face of firings, violence, and threats of internment. This struggle took place as the drive to maximize profits led to catastrophic failures of public health and environment. Many of the stories in this book are being told for the first time. It is an attempt to fill in the historical blanks with the class, racial, and intersectional realities that all too often have been airbrushed from Canada's accepted version of history. Within these chapters you will hear accounts of inequality, violence, and racial strife, as well as voices of heroism, solidarity, and larger-than-life bravado. This is not the history that we were taught in schools. These are stories that come from a place that is very culturally and economically distinct from the world that we are living in a century later. So, how could such events possibly matter today? In the near 20-year period of the silver and gold rush in northern Ontario, Canada changed dramatically as a nation. The Canada that was before and the Canada that came after were almost unrecognizable to each other. Cobalt played an important part in this transformation. A distinct economic model based on resource exploitation was established there, and it is one that has defined Canada's relationship to the environment ever since. In the 21st century, this relationship requires increasing scrutiny as we contemplate a world of melting ice and burning forests. So what can this return to the cradle of the Cobalts teach us in an age of pandemic, impending climate catastrophe, racial division, and class strife? It may be that the shape-shifting metal will prove to be the miracle ingredient that leads us to a more sustainable way of life. Or it may be that we need to find a less rapacious balance between environment, social justice, human rights, and the world's depleting resources. A century ago, there were those who came to Cobalt to loot one of the great treasure boxes of the earth. But there were others who came with the dream of making their lives in what they thought was a new frontier. For a moment, it seemed possible to dream of alternative futures in a land where the traditional social and economic hierarchies had yet to be entrenched. If ever there was a time to imagine an alternate future, it is now. This book is a history of a particular place at a particular time. That place is Canada. The time is today. Part 1. Discovery. You can trace the lines on a map of a country, chart your way to the heart of a country, explore, stake a claim, go down in history, write your name on a spot on a map, claim you found it. But does that make it yours? What does discover mean? To be pointed in the right direction by someone who will not be named, someone who knows the frozen land like the back of their weathered hand, someone about whom no songs will be written. Evelyn Perry. To Live in the Age of Melting. Northwest Passage. 1. Origin Stories. There is a story told about the discovery of the riches at Cobalt. In the summer of 1903, railway worker Frederick LaRose was at his blacksmith's forge when he was interrupted by a pesky fox. The frustrated LaRose threw his hammer at the creature. It missed, but hit a rock and broke off a piece of pure silver. And that accidental discovery launched one of North America's greatest mineral rushes. The first geologist who arrived at the mining camp described silver so abundant that huge chunks lay along the shores of Cobalt Lake, as big as stove lids and cannonballs. The myth of the hammer and fox is a great story, but it isn't true. There was no fox, and the discovery wasn't accidental. LaRose found silver because he was a dedicated amateur prospector who spent his off hours carefully studying the rocks along the rail line. Moreover, he wasn't even the first white person to discover silver in the region. LaRose attempted to tell journalists what had really happened, but no one was interested. The story of the hammer and fox quickly became the preferred version, because the folk tale was a much easier and more compelling way to sell the image of a land so rich that a person could become a millionaire simply by accident. The fact that a folk tale was used by journalists and businessmen to supplant the facts of the silver discovery might strike some as odd, but as H.V. Nellis writes, so remarkable were these discoveries in New Ontario that they could not be scaled by such mundane categories. They could only be measured in myths. But what do these settler myths say about the indigenous people who were already here? The tale of the hammer and fox reinforces a much more troubling fiction of settlement, that of terra nullius. Colonial claims in the Americas, Australia, and Africa were based on the dubious principle that the taking of indigenous land was justified, not because the land was actually empty, but because the original people were failing to use it according to European laws and custom. Thus, colonial narratives presented the indigenous people as drifters or indolent, or, in the case of Cobalt, unable to find wealth that was so obvious that it lay in pure form along the shores of Cobalt Lake. In fact, a complex indigenous silver mining trade in the region reached back thousands of years. Ceremonial panpipes made from cobalt silver have been found in burial mounds in Ohio, Georgia, and Mississippi. Silver jewelry from cobalt has been uncovered in archaeological digs in New York State. Nuggets of pure cobalt silver were carefully placed in Michigan burial sites. Some of these burial mounds, known as Hopewell sites, are massive earthworks representing ingenious human endeavors that rival the construction of the great Egyptian pyramids. Who were the ancient indigenous peoples who built these sites and traded in the beautiful cobalt silver? It is not clear. Even the use of the term Hopewell to describe the people as well as the mounts reveals the influence of the settler lens. It was the name of the white farmer on whose property the first site was discovered. Just how far back the trade in northern minerals goes is also hard to determine. Mining in cobalt stretches back at least 2,000 years. Copper mining in the neighboring northern Great Lakes region has been dated as far back as 6,000 years. So how did these silver trading networks work? Some archaeologists believe the Hopewell came north on spiritual quests to dig out the silver at Cobalt and neighboring Goganda. But it is more likely that the Algonquin and Ojibwa peoples, who have always maintained strong control over their territories, mined these local deposits and then traded the silver to southern nations. If this is the case, they would have taken the silver out through their trading center at the narrows of Lake Temiskaming, 20 kilometers from Cobalt, a place the Algonquin called Obajawan, meeting place. From Obajawan, they would have portaged the silver through a series of rapids and then into the Ottawa River system. The Ottawa River was the doorway to the trade at Lake of Two Mountains, west of Montreal, that connected to trade networks in the Great Lakes. When white fur traders first came north in the 1600s, they met the indigenous people at Obajawan, where they established a fur trading post on one side of the Narrows, with a Roman Catholic mission on the other side of Lake Temiskaming. Fort Temiskaming lay in the shadow of the rich silver fields of what was to become the mining town of Silver Center, at the edge of the cobalt-silver region. However, neither the white traders nor the clergy had any knowledge of the enormous silver wealth in the overlooking hills. In 1821, the fort came under the control of the Hudson's Bay Company. The HBC was an international corporation, but it maintained a pre-capitalist barter economy, often paying the indigenous fur trappers in alcohol and maintaining a strict accounting over their purchases of flour, pots, and fabric. When the Hudson Bay fort at Lake Temiskaming overcharged the indigenous hunters for guns and bullets, the hunters simply went into the bush and fashioned bullets from pure silver. They never told the fort's factor or head of the rich silver deposits that lay in the hills nearby. So why this silence? Anson Guard, who chronicled the cobalt-silver rush as it happened, said that the indigenous people were aware of the presence of the silver veins, but they believed that great misfortune would befall them if the white men knew. We find a similar code of silence in place among the Ojibwa, who mined copper along the northern Great Lakes. For accounts of the relationship between the indigenous peoples and the metal resources of the north, we can look to traditional knowledge. The Ojibwa story of Nanabiju, for example, serves as a cautionary tale against sharing the secrets of mineral wealth. Nanabiju was a giant who protected the indigenous people of the northern boreal forest. Nanabiju revealed the secrets of a rich silver mine to the Ojibwa, but warned that they must never share this information. But despite their best efforts, the white men learned of the location of the mine at Silver Islet on Lake Superior. They came with their dynamite and shaft-sinking machines, and Nanabiju was turned to stone, becoming the famous sleeping giant in the harbor of Thunder Bay. The Ojibwa lost their guardian and were left exposed to the influx of white men. A year after the Silver Islet mine was established in 1868, the Hudson's Bay Company relinquished control of their vast trading territories across northern Canada in a deed of surrender to the newly established country of Canada. This opened the region to a flood of railway workers, trappers, and prospectors, who brought with them the exploitation, alcohol, and disease that devastated the traditional economies and cultures of the northern indigenous peoples. Those diseases, diphtheria, typhoid, influenza, and tuberculosis, decimated the hunting bands of the north. Around Cobalt, the demise of the HBC led to increasing pressure on two indigenous bands. At the head of Lake Temiskaming, the Saugeen Anishinaabeg, Algonquins of Temiskaming First Nation, were being pressured to give up their reserve lands by lumber crews and oblate missionaries looking to take their lands for farming families. Adam Burwash was a squatter who built his farm on the Saugeen Anishinaabeg Reserve, despite the deep opposition of the local chief. but he was well connected among the regional liberal establishment. When Sir Wilfrid Laurier was elected Prime Minister, Burwash the squatter was made an Indian agent, which gave him state-sanctioned control over the affairs of the community. He immediately began selling off large sections of land to incoming settlers. Burwash invested the money from these sales in a local silver mine and became enormously rich. He justified his actions on the premise that indigenous people were on the verge of becoming extinct. South of Cobalt, in the land known as Nidakmenen, Temagami, the pressure on the Teme Agama Anishinaabe, Tagami First Nation, was even more relentless. Their territory had not been designated a reserve by treaty, so they were seen as squatters by the government. In the 1870s, Chief Tonini attempted to negotiate with Ottawa for a land base for his people. He warned that the white men were coming closer and closer every year, and the deer and furs were becoming scarcer and scarcer, so that in a few more years Indians could not live by hunting alone. The Temagami people had carefully delineated family hunting territories, but Chief Tonini knew the white government would never recognize their territorial land rights. So he encouraged his people to take up farming, in the hope that settled indigenous farmers would be harder to evict. Tonini wrote a series of letters to both the provincial and federal governments, but to no avail. Liberal Premier Oliver Mowat was extremely hostile to Tonini and his advocacy. By the turn of the 20th century, the provincial government made the decision to drive the Temiskaming and Northern Ontario Railway, T&NO, through the heart of Tonini's territory, in order to access the area's rich red and white pine forests. The plan was predicated on the removal of the indigenous people from the terrain. As Bruce Hodgins and Jamie Benedictson write in their account of the region, between 1897 and 1905, the world of Temagami Indians changed dramatically. They seemed almost to become squatters on their own land, severely restricted and controlled in their lifestyle by a provincial regime that hardly recognized them and barely tolerated their presence, except as short-term casual employees. The question of how the Temagami people would survive once they were dispossessed of their lands was not something that troubled white politicians. The policy was rooted in another toxic myth of the American and Canadian frontier, that of the vanishing Indian. This was a belief that the fundamental racial inferiority of indigenous people would ultimately lead to their extinction, as white settlers moved in and took their lands. At this time, few were interested in the opinions of a people who were thought to be disappearing before the so-called March of Progress. American anthropologist Frank Speck was an exception. During his field work with the Temagami and Temiskaming in the summer of 1913, Speck recorded the story of Rabbit and Lynx. "Can you talk English?" said Lynx. "Yes," answered Rabbit. "Well, can't you talk white?" "Yes," answered Rabbit. "Well, if you don't talk white, I'll kill you." So Rabbit had to talk white. "What do you call fire in English?" "Wayakapite," people sitting around a fire, answered Rabbit. "How do they say axe there?" "Mematawasing," noise of chopping. "What do you call knife?" asked Lynx. "Tayateki wejise," sliced meat, answered Rabbit. "You are a liar," said Lynx. "Kinigwazem," you are a liar. And then Lynx killed Rabbit. What does this story tell us? When Lynx asks Rabbit if he can speak English, Rabbit responds affirmatively, but then Lynx presses further, demanding that Rabbit speak white. Thus, Lynx's deceptively simple questions reveal the fundamental divide in all negotiations between indigenous people and settlers, the clash of world views when it comes to understanding their place in the environment. The word Rabbit uses for fire is an Ojibwa description of the role fire plays in creating community and safety. Rabbit's language emphasizes the interrelationship between subject, object, and environment, a holistic perspective that is fundamental to the indigenous worldview. To white people, however, these items, fire, knife, axe, are merely tools to be exploited for individual gain, a view that extends to the Earth's natural resources. The story indicates that it isn't enough for Rabbit simply to speak the language of the dominant society. Rabbit must perceive the world through a white lens. He needs to understand that the exploitation of resources is driven by the theory of abstract values. Rabbit's rejection of Lynx's predatory approach to relationships and the environment leads to the death of Rabbit.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?